Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar education event. We are going to give people a few more minutes to find their seats. We're so happy that you've joined us today. Thank you so much for spending your morning or maybe afternoon with us, depending on where you are. Today's event is sponsored by Motion Composites, and it is a CEC. We will be presenting a really great topic. I hope you learn something new and think about things in a new way. It's about a tiny little piece of the chair that we overlook all the time. It's the casters. So today's presentation is Front Caster Selection, the Functional Importance. Your hosts today, your presenters, will be Todd Richardson, ATP and East Coast Sales Manager for Motion Composites, as well as Tina Rosler, Physical Therapist and Director of Clinical Education and International Business Development. Hi, Tina. Hey, Todd.
Hey, guys. How are you today?
Great. So we're just going to give people a little bit more time, about half full. For those of you that are new to GoToWebinar, congratulations. You figured out the registration and you found your way here. Awesome. So as we move forward, you'll notice on the right side of your screen, you have the control panel. And there are little drop-down menus all along that control panel. First things first, you will be muted the entire call, so don't panic there or struggle with that. Also, your webcam will be off. Just the instructors will be sharing their cameras. You'll also notice there are some drop-downs going down the screen. There's a questions tab. So if you have any questions about the content, we can either interrupt and ask the question on your behalf, or we may just answer it quickly in the chat. And then we also have a formal chat box as well that we'll put general announcements or links or anything like that. So go ahead and familiarize yourself with most likely the right side of your screen if you're on a computer. And also we have a handouts drop down. That's going to be really great documents that Tina and Todd want to share with you. Instead of emailing it out, we've got these really great PDFs right in the software. So if you want instruction manual on how to square the casters, you want a Newton pamphlet, anything like that, click the link, it will open in your browser. You can then download it to your computer or device, save it to your cloud, or print it directly from there. So just wanted to make sure you guys had access. We will be having an interactive presentation today, so you may notice some polls that will pop up, and that's just for us to gauge your understanding and get to know a little bit about you. If you have any issues with it, don't worry, but we would love your interaction. So let's see. I think we can probably get started soon here. It seems like the numbers have been pretty stable. So again, welcome guys. Today's presentation is Front Caster Selection and Functional Importance. Take it away, guys.
Internet went out. I'm over in Italy, actually. So I'm Tina. I think some of you guys know me. Just to introduce myself, I'm a physical therapist, but I've worked in the industry for over 20 years now. So we're going to go ahead, I think, and get started. I think Todd already did his introduction there.
Yep.
Again, I apologize, but we do want to tell you a little bit about Motion Composites as well. Just a quick overview of Motion Composites. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video. Our mission is really to lead the evolution of mobility, and David and Eric here pictured are our two co-founders. Just a little bit about the company. We're located in Saint-Roch, which is in Quebec, just outside of Montreal, about 30-35 kilometers north. The first product launched in Canada in 2008, but it was actually a successful university project in 2005 that led Eric and David to then pursue developing the product fully. It was the first folding. Yeah.
The slides are not advancing.
Hold on.
I can't see the screen. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
Okay. No, that's important. Can you see it now?
All I see is motion minutes.
We see your title slide from the presentation.
Hold on. Yeah. Can you guys make sure that I'm the presenter?
Aha, sorry. You were, and then we weren't. Hold on.
You're presenter now.
All right, guys.
You were, and then you left, and then sorry about
Okay.
that.
That's okay. So first folding carbon chairs on the market, 2016, we then launched the Carbon Air Apex, which is a rigid frame. We are now proud to say that we are distributed in over 30 countries worldwide, and I think some of you are actually represented here on the call today. Like I said, we were first known for really carbon folding chairs, and for the first 7, 8 years or so, that's really all they sold. So the Helios C1 followed by the C2, which was the next update to that product, and then by the Veloce. And then again, like I said, in 2016, they launched their first rigid chair, which is a open frame design, fully carbon frame, but also fully adjustable. So we're really proud of the products, but we also want to get right down to it and start talking about what this webinar is all about. And that's about the front caster. So I think a lot of you out there have been doing this for a long time. Some of you maybe are new. And that's actually, we want to know who you are too, so that we have a good idea. So we're going to do a poll really quickly of who you are in the class. So you should have a poll that has popped up on your screen in just a moment. And we'll give you a couple minutes or a minute or so, 30 seconds to answer it if you can see it. Great, and we'll share the results real quickly. So most of you are ATPs, physical therapists, occupational therapists, suppliers, and tech. So it's a good mix of you on the call, which I think is good too, because I think sometimes what we see is when we start talking about casters. I've done some prescriptions with therapists and I say, well, what kind of caster do you want? And sometimes the response is, oh, I let the supplier do that. Or I ask the supplier, why did you pick that caster? They're like, oh, because that's what I'm used to. We want to give you this presentation. Todd and I are going to talk through it and talk about why it's so critical and so important, even though it's such a small component of the chair. It's easy to kind of forget about the importance and to forget the impact that it will have on the user. So what's the clinical significance of it? I think really, if you think about it, it is the first point of contact with the environment. It also can have a huge impact on the ride that the user feels. So that vibration or just the feel of the road or the surface that they're going on. And it can really have an impact on efficiency. It will also affect things like front seat to floor height. And also we'll go on to all these things in more detail. It'll also impact your ability to position the lower extremities how you want. So what are some of the considerations? Todd and I are going to go through this. So these are kind of the 4 things we're going to go through: size, material, lifestyle, and lower extremity positioning. Because it's really easy to say this size does this, that size does that, but you really need to consider all of these points together. So let's go ahead and start with caster diameter. And I'm sure some of you have never really thought about the difference between diameter and width, but it's really kind of important. If you look at a lot of the research, it says that a caster can roll over something half its height. So I have a lot of people who say, well, if that's the case, I know this person has a 3-inch threshold, so I'm going to go with a 6-inch caster. Not always the best choice. And it really impacts the maneuverability of the chair and the turning radius of the chair. So you really want to consider it carefully. Todd, do you have something to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, your caster size on that is such a crucial choice. And I always like to, kind of backing up a little bit, whenever speccing a chair or doing a new chair for myself, I like to look at it in that every chair that is specced is a little bit like if you could look into your bank account at the end of the year and see all of just your deposits. Some of them are really game changers, some of them are smaller, but they all make a difference in the whole picture of how that chair is set up. And casters are one of those things, and they do get overlooked quite a bit, but it's a huge difference. You know, as far as the resistance that caster is gonna contribute to the chair on an initial turn on a surface, or just the rollability, rolling resistance, and then the ability to go over obstacles. It's a huge issue. Can really make a big difference in a chair. And I also want to introduce myself. I've been an ATP for a long period, but I've also been in a chair, T4 paraplegic from a motocross injury back in '87. So I've used everything from starting out in a Quickie 2 with 8-inch casters. That was a nightmare. And have progressed into rigid frames that are pretty high performance oriented. So there's a huge difference in the selection of these individual pieces, casters being one that's very important.
I think you also have to look at sometimes every choice we make is we're sacrificing something. And for example, if positioning is one of my critical factors, if positioning for propulsion or function is really important, sometimes my caster selection might impact my ability to position the lower extremities. For example, if I use a caster of a larger diameter, but I want a specific seat to floor or a specific front frame angle, it may limit my ability to get those positions because the caster might interfere with the frame or interfere with the lower extremity. So it's very important. I also have people who have chosen larger casters because they say, oh, I want to maximize the front seat to floor height because of one transfer. I always say that for every option that you're looking at, you want to configure that chair for the 90% of their time, not the 10%. So maybe it is a difficult transfer. Say it's a transfer in and out of, just say their bed. They do that transfer once or twice a day. The other 90% of the time, is that higher seat to floor height, larger caster impacting the rest of their function? So I think that's important with every option you consider, whether it's a push handle or a caster or a rear wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's one of those that you just try to take in all the different factors. The person's disability, the person's confidence in a chair can also make a difference on what caster and how you're going to set that chair up with center of gravity and everything. There's a lot of different things that you would consider on that, but you know, just looking at environment, usage, is the person real aggressive or a little bit more laid back in their use? There's a lot of things to consider on that.
So usually diameter is the first thing people, and one of the things I think we forget is caster width, because caster width will also have a huge impact on performance. It used to be you didn't have much choice. You had a 1-inch wide polyurethane caster, and that was it. Now you also have soft roll or wider casters that might be 1.5, 1 3/4 inch wide. What that does is if you go with a wider caster, it might allow you then to go to a smaller diameter, because a wider caster will actually roll over obstacles easier. So say I have a 5 by 1 inch caster. If I switch to a 4 by 1.5, I should be able to go over obstacles just as easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely will. You know, the 1-inch casters, or even sometimes you find them below that 1-inch width, I always kind of jokingly refer to them as pizza cutters, because they're very harsh. When you get off in any kind of soft surface, you can feel them sink right down into that surface. Grass, sand, dirt, anything like that. Gravel is a nightmare. Where if you go with a little bit wider caster, you can get away with a lot smaller diameter, better performance, less restrictions with it, but you're going to still roll over surfaces that are soft better because you've got more surface area the ground's coming into contact with.
And do remember though, on the other hand, if you're just going on smooth surfaces, a wider caster might actually increase resistance. So you want to consider where that chair is being used and who's propelling it and how they're propelling it.
Yeah. And another factor on the caster itself is the tire, where some of them are shaped to where very little of the tire comes into contact with the ground. Those are all going to have much less rolling resistance. There were a few casters out a little while ago. I think some companies still use them. They're a very flat profile tire, and you've got a lot of contact with the ground on a very soft, rubbery material. And when you go to initiate a turn with those casters, it's much harder to initiate a turn because the caster has so much surface area on the ground that it bites much harder, and it feels like it's resisting you a little bit when you go to turn from a dead stop. So it all kind of plays into that on a caster choice.
Yeah, so Todd started talking about material type of the tire and the actual shape of it. When you look at material casters of the tire, so we're actually even separating this out into the tire and the hub. So the tire type, you have pneumatic casters, and I have up on the slide that it's really not the best choice. while I will jump up and down and scream and yell that people should have pneumatic rear wheels if they can, I will also jump up and down and say, unless it's a very specific user, do not give them pneumatic casters. It is the first point of impact. They tend to go down and be punctured more easily than, say, a rear tire. And they can be very difficult to maintain. So unless someone has the ability to maintain that and has some very good reasons why they want to use it, it's really important. They do provide, obviously, a smoother ride because they're pneumatic, right? But you do really need to weigh the consequences of that.
Mm-hmm.
You also have standard polyurethane, which is probably the most common. They're usually the no-charge option. They can roll over smooth surfaces well. They require little maintenance. They're pretty durable. And then you have soft roll, which I think I would say on our order form, it is the most popular selection of an upgraded caster would be a soft roll. All that means is it's still a rubber caster, but it's a little bit softer durometer. So it means that it improves the ride characteristics. It's not as much of a rough ride. Most of them tend to be a little bit wider, so you also have the wider width, but it can increase the resistance. And it used to be they needed frequent changing. The original soft rolls that came out, if you hit a rock the wrong way, it would break off part of the rubber. They're much more durable now than they used to be. They don't need to be replaced that often.
Yep. Yeah, and you know, some of the older tires that they have, and again, some still out there, if it's really a soft roll, a lot of times if you do get caster flutter at all or anything like that, they will really bite into the ground and slow the chair down dramatically, pretty quickly. I've had that experience once in a different brand chair that I rode the front wheels, and I'm a T4, so just kind of held onto the frame and rode the front wheels only for a few feet, and almost pitched me out going really, really fast. So the compound we use is just a nice compromise between the poly and a rubber that really smooths out the ride. That, in conjunction with some of our carbon frames, really smooths out the ride quite a bit.
So I think what you want to look for is you want to look for something that gives a little bit, whether it's a poly or a soft roll. You want a tire that does help smooth the ride, but doesn't make the ride bouncy, because there's a difference.
Yeah.
The other thing you might have the choice of is the material type. So the actual hub of the wheel, so the center part of the wheel. You usually have composite or plastic wheels. They're lightweight, they're durable for most users. They're usually no charge or little upcharge, depending on the kind of tire, actually, usually. And then you have aluminum or metal alloy. Now, one of the trade-offs with aluminum is obviously the weight. So you can find some soft rolls where the aluminum hub is just about the same weight as the composite or plastic, but not always. So if you have someone who maybe isn't great at wheelchair skills, has a hard time, say, popping their front casters up, you might not want to weigh down their front end with an aluminum hub unless they need it. It's a great option for difficult terrain or someone who's really rough on their front end.
Yeah. Yeah, abusive users or really hard users, that's a really durable wheel. That was always our go-to setup on that.
So we're going to go over forks and stem bolts just for a minute because we know that they go together with casters. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about it. We just want you to remember some of the basics about caster flutter, and you can't talk about that without talking about forks. On folding chairs, you usually get to select the combination that gives you the proper seat to floor height. And that's usually the only thing people are looking at. Seat to floor height, what fork, stem bolt, and caster am I going to use? If you have a choice between a, say, 5-inch fork and a standard configuration, you can see that on the slide, or a 4-inch fork and even a 2-inch stem bolt, you always want to choose a longer stem bolt and a shorter fork, because it will ride better, it will have a smaller turning radius, and it will also help prevent or minimize caster flutter. So if you have a choice, longer stem bolt, shorter fork. With rigid chairs, usually the fork is selected for you based on the seat to floor height. Most rigid chairs have casters that are custom placed or custom done, so you don't really have to worry about those options.
Yeah, but another crucial part of the caster choice is how close can you pull that frame in to where your wheels, when they spin around, that radius doesn't have your casters hitting your feet in a rigid frame or your heels in a folder? That can make a big difference in how tight, how small that package is for maneuverability at the end of the day. So that's a huge choice on the stem bolt part of that and caster setup.
Yep. So you really want to look at how the fork stem bolt caster combination increases efficiency, and it's really about the trail of the caster. And if you look at the drawing on there, it's that's the distance between the center of the stem bolt and the center of the axle of the caster. A longer trail can decrease the caster flutter at higher speeds, but it can also cause other problems. So you really have to be careful and know how that person's using the chair, where they're using it, and how fast they might be going. Larger wheels typically have a shorter trail, a larger wheel, so they begin to flutter at slower speeds. So if you have grandma in the long-term care facility, even though she's not pushing, if someone's pushing them down her downhill or pushing really fast, you're going to see caster flutter. So it's not just limited to people going really high speeds, doing wheelies and things like that. A small trail due to a short fork and a short caster is going to flutter less than the same trail with a larger caster. Make sense? And again, we actually have a whole presentation just on caster flutter, so we're not going to go into great detail. We do have, though, one of the things on caster flutter, there's a couple ways you can help prevent it. Our folding chairs have a anti-flutter caster housing, and that is actually one of the handouts that you have. And also, we also have this technical training document that you can see that goes through the different types of caster housings we have and how to square that caster to 90 degrees to the ground, because that's going to be also an important part of eliminating or limiting caster flutter.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's off just a little bit, I promise you can get flutter real quick.
So if you look down at the handouts on the right-hand side, the handouts you have squaring the caster housing, and then the third one down says anti-flutter caster housing. So before we move on, I want to ask one more question. So I'm going to put up one more poll, and that is, when you are choosing front casters, what is the most common size you choose? This is just for our information, because I'm always intrigued to see what people are selecting. All right, I'm going to close the poll. And I would say that's what I would expect to see. So about 56% of you said 5-inch, 28% said 4-inch. I'm actually surprised that's as high as it is.
That's awesome.
And 17% said 6-inch. Yeah, and I think both Todd and I are very opinionated about caster size.
Yeah,
I will tell. Yeah.
I think going as small as you can while addressing all that patient's, like again, the environment, the user, the confidence, the center of gravity on the chair, how it's set up, the disability. As small as you can go safely with that client is just going to enhance performance, maneuverability of that chair significantly. And one thing I want to go back to real quick, Tina, is on the caster flutter. If a stem bolt is over tightened, we've got a unique ability to take out flutter and take out some of the looseness of a caster with just a fine adjustment at the top of our caster cap. If that's not really properly tensioned, and I'm super picky on my chair when the stem bolt is just a little bit tight and it's just a little sticky, I always flip it back on the back wheels and just hold it horizontally to the ground and drop it. If it doesn't swing freely back and forth with no play, that's the key, then it's not set up just perfectly. And when you're sitting on, say you're in a living room on a hardwood floor, and you go to initiate a turn, if that caster is a little too tight, if the caster stem bolt and the whole configuration is adjusted a little too tight, the casters tend to want to stick when you make that initial movement in the direction they previously were. So it can almost feel like somebody's holding your chair when you first go to take off each time. And it can really be this weird, unsettling feeling. So that adjustment is crucial too in the performance of the chair.
Perfect. So how do we make the right choice? I think sometimes we do these presentations and we don't want you to get so caught up on just casters, but I think there are things that you have to consider. Where the chair will be used, what are the positioning needs, how the chair is going to be propelled. Is it someone who's propelling with their hands and feet? Are they self-propelling? Are they being pushed? So all of those things can make my choices either broader or more narrow. And also accessibility. I always talk about the overall frame length of the chair and the turning radius. Consider where that person's living, what kind of bathroom they have, where else are they functioning every day. Because that becomes very important. And the casters can make a difference of a couple inches on turning radius and ability to get into small spaces. I think most people, the choice is first dictated by chair configuration, both lower extremity position and front seat to floor height. For example, most Hemi height chairs, you do have to go to a smaller caster, one to get the seat to floor height, but also to get clearance for the lower extremities to push the chair.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that most of the people that I've prescribed Hemi height chairs for are usually operating on smooth surfaces 95% of the time. So I feel confident going with, say, a 4-inch caster if I need to get that low seat to floor height. On the other hand, if I have someone who I really want to squeeze into the chair and have their legs underneath them for a better pelvic position, I might also have to go to a smaller caster, because as I bring the legs further under the chair, depending on how the manufacturer makes those front riggings, the caster might interfere with either the chair or the person's lower extremities.
Yeah.
Where's the chair going to be used? Again, I think we talked through this on most of it. Do they go over various surfaces? Are they mostly on smooth floors? Because maybe a 1-inch standard caster is fine for them. Are they going outside? Are they, popping up over curbs? Are they going on, I live in a town that's all cobblestone. A normal caster wouldn't work here.
No.
And again, considering type or propulsion. So all of these things have to play into that choice. So what does Motion Composites offer? We're just going to go through quickly what we offer on the order form just for the casters. Really, we have a standard caster that tend to be 1-inch width. Some are a little bit wider. They're a composite wheel with a polyurethane tire, and they're no charge. We do also offer a pneumatic caster because there are people who still request and still are utilizing pneumatic casters. We see it more actually in long-term care, which ironically I find they are less maintained there, but they do offer a softer ride. But we do have to remember that they require maintenance.
Yep. Yeah, very functional for certain circumstances, but they are definitely tricky on maintenance. The tubes hold very little air compared to a rear tire, so it bleeds out very quickly. Over time, if you have to inflate your rear wheels every 2 to 3 weeks, anticipate about every week with a caster. So it's maintenance intensive, and that valve stem can be kind of hard to get at too. So you've got to have pretty strong fingers and good dexterity to get in to do that.
Yeah, I worked with one person who lived in New York City, and he was a sales rep in New York City. So in and out over all these weird surfaces, he used pneumatic casters, but he also carried an extra set of tubes with him and knew how to change them out very quickly because he knew the risks of that.
Yeah, I can see it in New York City. You have to be very attentive to your surface there. I just came back from a trip there, and it's you got to be on your toes for sure.
So the other thing we have is the Newton soft roll, or the Newton Ultra caster, which is a soft roll caster that is proprietary to Motion Composites. It is branded as Newton, so you can use it on any chair. It comes in 4, 5, and 6 inch. It's 1.5 inches wide. And then you have the option of an aluminum and composite hub. So there's a couple of differences between some of the other soft rolls. It's about 10% lighter than some of the leading soft rolls. It has a little bit more rebound, which means sometimes I do this in an in-service. I will pick up the caster and I'll throw it onto the ground and it bounces back up into my hands. I just warn you, be careful, because if it bounces wrong, it might hit you in the face. It's also about 16% more tear resistant, so it has better durability. Like I said, some of the older soft rolls used to rip and tear very easily, so people stayed away from them because they were a little more expensive, but they didn't seem to hold up. That's no longer the case. Also, you'll notice that the difference, so the caster in the back that you can't see very well is the composite hub, and then the caster in the front, that's the aluminum hub. And one of the things we want to point out is the way you can tell the difference on our casters, on the Newton Ultracaster, is the aluminum hub has that small red sleeve in there. And basically all that sleeve does is makes it easier for maintenance and makes it so that you don't get the bearings seizing up against the metal on metal. That's all it does. They're both labeled with names and size, and there is very minimal weight difference between the aluminum and the composite hub. So if you really think you want more durability, you're not necessarily sacrificing by going with the aluminum hub.
Yeah, very minimal difference. I don't think I could tell the difference on that.
Yeah. So bringing it all back together, remember selection is very user specific. I want to consider what are their skills? What are their skills going to be? So be careful. If you're dealing with someone who's new to a chair, but you expect that they're going to gain skills, don't take that ability away from them by not configuring the chair for their potential, by only configuring for what you see now. Especially in the United States, we're making decisions very, very early, but we can use our common sense and our clinical knowledge to say, we have an idea of where this person should or will progress to.
Yep. And that goes to just a clinical team that where I grew up is an ATP and started my career. I was very lucky in the sense of having clinicians where it was very much a team approach. I brought in the equipment side of it and my perspective on the equation. The PT brings in theirs, but the client ultimately is the leader of that group. And when you go approach it as a team like that and really point out to the client and spend time on this issue with casters, you know, picture this where you live. You think you're going to have trouble with this. How are your wheeling skills coming? You know, I used to get, when I'd pull into a rehab center, I would do a wheelie to spin around and reach something, and they would comment, the patient would comment about, oh man, we got this guy doing tricks. Yeah, it's not tricks. It is a very, very functional skill, and that's going to really determine caster's choice on that too. So, you know, like anti-tips, by the time I deliver the permanent chair, he's already taken his anti-tips off on the loaner chair, and we're trying to find them when I pick it up. So it's a little bit like that with caster. They're going to progress very, very quickly sometimes, other times not. Other times it's a situation where their condition may change and they may need a bigger caster in 6 months. So you just try to look in the crystal ball if you can a little bit, make good decisions as a group, talk about it openly, and let that client kind of lead you down that path. And it takes the pressure off the clinicians like that. And really, at the end of the day, does the user a huge favor on that.
Yeah, and I think you have to realize that also configuration will affect it. And the configuration of the overall chair is going to also impact their ability to acquire those skills.
Yes.
Everything's give and take. So it's really about finding the balance, but also considering each accessory, each thing you have to select carefully. So it's not just about the size. It's not just about the seating. It even goes down to something as small as the caster. And that's really what we're trying to get across. So with that, we can open it up to questions if you'd like, if anyone has any questions.
So there was a question about whether or not this PowerPoint would be available as a handout. There were maybe 2 or 3 people requesting this information as a handout.
We don't have that arranged right now, but we could make it available if you want to email education@Motion Composites, or we can send out a second follow-up email.
Okay, great.
If you are able to email it to me or Christy right now, we can go ahead and upload it in the background while you.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Are they unmuted? Sorry.
No, they're not able to use their microphones, but we're reading them out of the question box.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
We have one from Maz. Let me open this up. Different manufacturers select different stem bolts and lengths on rigid frame chairs based on STF selection. How can we ensure that we aren't being surprised with a longer stem bolt?
Well, on rigid chairs, really the maximum you usually see is a 1-inch stem bolt, because you're going to see custom lengths on the front end and custom caster placement to try to avoid that.
Yep. Yeah, and I always try to look at the fork and stem bolt configuration and see what the options are and how they do it. And I always try to specify that right up front, because yeah, that is a concern. You don't want to be surprised when the chair comes in and it's in your delivery rack with its configuration. But I always try to specify that on my chairs or talk to someone on the phone about it when ordering.
Is it something that a CAD drawing could help with, since Motion Composites makes that available?
Yes, absolutely.
It can, but I like I said though, very rarely you're not going to see a rigid chair with usually more than a 1/2 inch, but sometimes up to 1 inch.
Yeah.
Do all composite chairs have the anti-flutter adjustment, such as the Veloce? This is from Dwayne Rhodes.
The Veloce and the Apex do not have the anti-flutter adjustment.
Yep, neither does the Apex.
So the Helio chairs all have the.
Helios all do. Yep, and on the Apex, Veloce, you can go underneath where the stem is and the fork connects to it, and that's really the adjustment for how the caster journal or how that fork is going to spin. So I just loosen that nut, tighten it a little bit just to fine tune that. And from every manufacturer on almost every delivery I've ever done, that's part of my delivery process, is tweaking that to make sure that it has no resistance at all. Otherwise it can really have a person get an odd feeling from the chair that it's hard to quantify where that's coming from. But it's an important little adjustment.
Ralph,
yeah, I see that question from Ralph about advantages in caster selection for use with active power assist users. So I think it depends on what type of power assist. You're right, if they're using like a smart drive or something like that, you might want to look at a wider caster, maybe sometimes a bigger caster if you can. Now in Europe where I'm at, they use a lot of front end add-on bikes that actually lift the front casters off the ground. So then you don't really have to think that.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
I always say, remember that when people get these, they tend to go, yeah, I think people go places where they maybe didn't before or couldn't before when they get a power assist. So you have a whole different consideration.
Yeah, and they can't wheelie as smoothly or as fluidly as they normally would to avoid obstacles. So that's a huge consideration. And you know, you may even want to go up in size if you think you need to go that far, certainly wider. But also when someone pushes a chair from behind, that also front loads a chair. So it puts more pressure down on the casters typically. So that's something to consider as well. Like your 1-inch polys, like a 5-inch 1-inch poly when someone's pushing a chair, really puts a lot of pressure forward on the casters, and that it can surprise people. Different height plates on a sidewalk and that kind of thing. You just don't want to get that sudden stop. So, you know, maybe going a little wider, larger, different configurations there to help on that. So that's all that individual eval and kind of seeing usage of the chair.
Barry Brewis asks, when is it worth considering a suspension fork?
We knew this question would come up, Todd.
Yeah.
I think both of us have opinions on this. I don't have a strong opinion either way. I think if you have the right frame, rear wheel, caster combination, they can have a benefit sometimes, but sometimes they don't. I feel like with carbon or titanium and a good front caster, it's not always necessary.
Yep. And that goes to our center of gravity class yesterday, where if the center of gravity is correct, the caster composition is correct, a carbon frame like that, or titanium, or the aluminum, good quality aluminum chair, you know, they ride so well today. When the suspension forks first came out, a lot of guys jumped over to them. I had an XTR, the old suspension chair by Sunrise, with a true suspension in the back, oil dampen, rebound, everything, and then elastomer suspension forks. And I found the rear to be great suspension, and that it was truly suspension. But I think the suspension forks, the elastomers, yes, they do compress. They absorb an obstacle, a little bit of a threshold or gravel, that type of thing. But they also rebound, and there's no rebound dampening at all. So it tends to throw the front of the chair up, which to me, the suspension, yeah, there's give and take there. Sometimes they do work for individuals, but I find their weight, that fact that they bounce compared to just absorbing or being a dampened true suspension. And, you know, transferring can also be an issue sometimes, where we find that if people grab way out on the end of their frame and their casters are in their trailing position, the chair can come forward on them, pitch forward. So it's a little bit of a unique usage on that, you know, use sparingly, I would say. You know, if somebody really needs it or they're really breaking a lot of front components, it's a good time to use it.
I also say look at the type of front suspension you're using, because there's more than one option out there. And I also like to look at the angle of the polymer and where is it taking the impact. So a lot of them, the polymer is 90 degrees to the ground, so it's in line with the stem bolt. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because most of the time when I'm making impact with a caster, it's not perpendicular to the ground. It's coming at an angle. So I like the ones that actually have the polymer at an angle, because it makes more sense that it's going to help absorb some of that a little bit better.
Yep.
This question from Brenda Sposato, it refers to individuals in long-term care facilities using folding wheelchairs. Caster selection is usually based on seat to floor and surface traversed. What are your thoughts for the person that spends 50% of the time indoors and 50% outdoors?
I would say you have to find a happy medium. I might, with that person, depending on how they're propelling, go with a soft roll and try to stay no bigger than a 5-inch caster. I think in long-term care, we see a lot of 6, 7, sometimes even still 8-inch casters, and that's going to be, I think, a little bit more difficult.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. It's compromise. And then what is the surface outdoors? Because that can mean a lot of different things. You know, it could mean a very nice brick surface outside of a long-term care facility and concrete and sidewalk and that kind of thing. There's nothing too threatening in that environment to, you know, go bigger or different than a, you know, 4 or 5 soft roll. But, you know, it's all individual on that. So it's a compromise. And then it's just experimenting and trying different things and seeing what works.
Do you have recommendations on caster position relative to wheelbase length? This is from Kevin Phillips.
Hi, Kevin. I knew you would ask a question like that. I am not a stickler for there is a specific position. Some people will say there has to be X number of inches between the rear axle and the center of the caster. From my experience, that can vary from person to person, and I base it mostly on their experience. And I also look, you obviously don't want them touching, you don't want them too close. Yet I've had users who are in very active, very independent in like a 13 by 13 frame, and they have 25-inch rear wheels and 4-inch casters, and they're almost touching. But I also know that their skill is so good that they know how to handle that.
Yep. Yep, absolutely
true. I don't know,
true.
Todd, if you look at anything specific on that.
Yeah, you know, caster placement for me, it's not so much forward backward for a lot of really skilled, more high performance type users. It's a little bit more of width. I always try to bring the casters in as far as I can, adjustment wise, and just make the chair, and again, the smaller caster helps on that. If there is any adjustability in, or ordering a chair where you can use maybe a shorter fork, a little bit narrower caster journal, that type of thing. But it does depend on use like that. You know, you wouldn't want to maybe have a caster journal really far back. Let's say you've got a C6-7 quad and they really put a lot of weight on the front of that chair when they go to transfer and get in it, in the caster journals far back, and you know, if they get it just right, the chair tips forward, something like that. But like Tina said, it's all skill set on the user, matching the disability, that kind of thing. So it doesn't, there's very few that are just, I look to have it be this measurement. It's very, very individual on that.
I would also say you can play around with that a little bit too. with, you talk about seat length and seat depth, or frame length, not seat length, but frame length. If I'm concerned that the frame overall caster to rear wheel, if it's too short and I feel like it's going to tip forward for them, I a lot of times will go maybe a standard frame on our chairs, or on some chairs 1 inch longer. So it really, again, is going to be dependent on the person.
Yeah.
Okay, we have from Syed Salman, hello from the UAE. Hello. What caster would you recommend for a 52-year-old lady who is going to self-propel her wheelchair when she is indoors, which includes her garden with not very smooth surface? It seems kind of similar to that question earlier.
Yeah, and it depends what sort, there's all different kinds of soil. Where I was in North Carolina as an ATP, there was a lot of sand. And that's a very different surface than the red clay of my area in South Carolina now. So it really depends on that, and just finding a happy medium. If there's any way to try demo chairs in a situation like that, have a supplier bring out one with 5s, one with 4s, or some combination where they can get a perspective on the difference. That can help. That's a very individual choice.
Yeah. I would say go with a wider caster for sure if they're going to be outside, and then just try to find the smallest size caster that's going to be functional for her.
Okay, and from Elaine Au, what are the caster selection considerations for self-propellers versus attendant-propelled chairs? Is there any difference?
Yeah, I think that really what you're looking at is, first you have to look at the positioning aspect of it, the lower extremities. I see a lot of larger casters on chairs that are going to be pushed because maybe they're not as aggressive with lower extremity positioning. And a larger caster, if someone is pushing it, will roll easier for the person pushing, but you still have to consider the accessibility and the lower extremity positioning.
Yep. You just want to go big enough that remembering that putting a little more pressure on those casters, you're not going to get that sudden stop on any kind of cobblestone or different level surface. So I'm a little bit more conservative maybe in my suggestions on that, and what a person may try or look at, but again, very individual on that.
You guys also consider skill set. If a person can pop wheelies themselves, you can go with that smaller caster. You don't have to work as hard to clear the obstacle. Whereas I think a lot of times people move towards that larger caster for the attendant propelled because it's not on the end user to clear that obstacle.
Well, I also think you need to consider the fact that attendant propelled chairs, we tend not to be as aggressive with center of gravity. So there is more weight typically over the front caster. So a larger caster will be easier to use to push over those obstacles as well, because we're weighting the front caster more if we don't have the center of gravity correct.
Yep.
Right. Usually the rear wheel is further back. The client's not pressure to propel as much. Okay, great. Just a lot of thank yous and a lot of great presentations from the audience. If you guys have any last questions you want to get in, but I think we did great. Any final words from our presenters?
No, thank you guys very much. And I apologize for the little glitch at the beginning, because of course, the only time my internet has ever gone out is when they said, take it away, Tina.
Yeah.
So luckily we recovered.
Right, you were frozen.
I think it was a good recovery.
Yes, it was great. I think we handled it smoothly. And for those of you interested in slides, we will get those to you. I'm sure I can do a mail out through this GoToWebinar list. But thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you for registering. We have always some new presentations we're putting together, both CECs and CEUs. So check out motioncomposites.com, go to support and education, and you'll find the latest and greatest in what's coming down the pipeline. Thank you so much. And anything extra you might want to ask, email education@motioncomposites.com. Thank you everyone, and stay safe.
Great.
Thanks guys.
Take care guys.
Bye.